Ja, hallo und guten Abend zu unserem Winzertalk mit dem Weingut Antonio Vallana, hier vertreten durch Marina vom Weingut. Ich stelle mich noch kurz vor, mein Name ist Mick Schulz, ich bin im Kölner Weinkeller mit für das Marketing zuständig und für den Fall, dass irgendjemand sich jetzt diesen Livestream anschaut oder dieses Video nachschaut. Der Kölner Weinkeller ist ein Weinhändler, schwierig auszusprechen, Feinweinhändler in Köln, wie der Name schon verrät. Wir haben einen Keller in 13 Meter Tiefe, einen schönen alten Gewölbekeller, der ist dieses Jahr 85 Jahre alt geworden und den nutzen wir als Verkaufsfläche. Es gibt aber selbstverständlich auch einen Online-Shop unter www.kölner-weinkeller.de ist der zu erreichen. Da kann man sehr viele schöne Weine kaufen, unter anderem auch die Weine von Vallana, über die wir uns heute unterhalten wollen. As Marina is more fluent in English than she is in German, we're going to switch languages now. And we're going to talk a little bit first about the winery, about the history of the winery. We're going to talk about the peculiar situation that you are in Alto Piemonte. And then we're going to taste 3 wines together. I hope that all our spectators and visitors have the wines ready so they can taste along, and you're always welcome to pose any questions in the chat. I'm going to relay them to Marina. So yeah, don't hesitate. It might take us a minute to actually address the questions because there's a slight delay. We're a little bit ahead of time right now. So let's start. Marina, when was Antonio Vallana e Figli, right? When was it founded? What can you tell me about the history of the winery?
So my winery was founded in its present form in 1937 by my great-grandfather. So Antonio would be my great-grandfather and his son, my grandfather. However, the family tradition dates back to a couple of centuries before that. And we date back the first commercial vineyard in the family to 1787. That is when a priest whose name was, I'll say it slowly for our German audience, Canonico Gaetano Perrucconi di Montalbano, was a priest, and he was serving the bishop of Novara. And at the time, the local bishop was not just a religious figure, but also political figure. And as it was normal at the time, the church had many belongings and was into farming as an important economic activity. So this priest, Canonico Gaetano Perrucconi, which is the guy whom you see when you pull the cork of our bottles, actually, he was what we would call, if we were in Bordeaux, we would probably call him negociant or something along those lines. He was a hybrid figure between a negociant, an agronomist, a winemaker. He managed all the vineyards that belonged to the Diocese of Novara in his main area of influence. So he knew most of the villages that compose the Colline Novaresi and the Coste della Sesia area, appellations of nowadays. And he really had a very site-specific knowledge of the best ones. In fact, he owned some land himself in Bocca, and specifically he had a small vineyard parcel that was used to make the best red wine for the formal occasions of the bishop. Mm-hmm. And when he was about to retire, he gave this piece of land to his niece, who was getting married in the Vallana family. So this little parcel is still in the family. The vines, of course, have changed many times through the centuries, but the land is still the same. And the knowledge of the parcels of the Alto Piemonte was passed in the family. Then between 1787 and 1937, my family carried out a mixed agricultural business. And then in 1937, that's when my great-grandfather decided that the fame of the wine had reached a sound, say, was sound enough, solid enough. And so they made this big step to quit every other business and become a fully fledged winery. And actually, there is an interesting link to Germany, because one of the reasons that led my great-grandfather to this step was the fact that one of his brothers was station master in the village just down the road, the main city, if you like, because Maggiora, where our winery is established, is only a very tiny 1,700 people village, whereas down the road there is this major town which is 12,000, and they were building the station, the railway station, and there was a line that connected the town to Germany, and his first export market for red wine was actually Germany as a country, because they didn't have a lot of red structured wine. Of course, they had plenty of white and light body red, etc. So his brother, as a station master, knew all the best merchants, and so he recommended the ones with whom he should make the deals for the wine. So actually, Germany is historically our first export market.
That's super interesting. I didn't know that. Awesome. So, and if my history is right, if I got everything together, Vallana was like one of the leading wineries in Alto Piemonte for quite a while.
Yeah. So my great-grandfather established a winery, but it was actually my grandfather, Bernardo, who was kind of the right person in the right period of time, I guess. He expanded the winery, especially exporting the finest wines to the United States. So the reason why I mentioned the history and the canonico in the 1800s is that the knowledge of the best parcels of Alto Piemonte was always kept in the family. And this is what allowed my grandfather, Bernardo, to know which wines to keep an age and which wines should be sold young. And what he did was quite clever. He started to lay down in bottle wines for aging, separating the single vineyards. And so he was doing this before the appellations of Alto Piemonte were established as such. So it was a time when there was no concept of cru or of vineyard hierarchy, no formal concept of vineyard hierarchy in the area. So he was a bit pioneer in this vision that he had. And he was also, he was lucky enough to find some smart American merchants who came to the winery, tasted out the wines, and decided to import the best wines. And he was one of the very first Piemontese producers to export to the United States. And that is, I would argue, still nowadays, the most important market for Piemontese wines, for sure, for Italian wines, where you really build the fame of the quality of your wine. And he was there in the 1950s, just after the war. He was also quite lucky because, and this brings me to speak about the area of Alto Piemonte in general. We will go back to this probably, but during the World War, the two World Wars, Alto Piemonte was decimated in terms of vineyard surface. But for personal reasons, for example, my grandfather was one of the lucky men who did not have to go and fight. So he was able to keep his business going. So yes, he was making really good wines, but he also had a really unique opportunity compared to other men in his position to stay at the winery and run his business through the war years, which was obviously a big advantage. Yeah. And we will go back to this if we speak about Alto Piemonte in general.
I think we'll have to probably intertwine the history of Alto Piemonte and the history of the winery, because what you've mentioned now is like, yeah, it's the history of Alto Piemonte that plays into the history of the winery and vice versa. So maybe we could now take a step back and like talk about the history of Alto Piemonte, and then like switch back and forth between the winery history and the history of the Alto Piemonte in general, because that would probably make more sense. Because you've mentioned a couple of things already that are like Alto Piemonte history. So maybe we could start with the Alto Piemonte, like the geographical location, which is super interesting. And yeah, maybe if you want to, you can start talking about that, and we can discern the several crews there are, or the several villages there are, and then come back to the winery.
Sure. So I am assuming that our guests tonight are passionate about Italian wine, and I'm also assuming that they might have different levels of knowledge. So I will make it super simple, and those who have already a bit of knowledge will probably find the details very interesting, and those who are more sort of beginning to have an interest in Italy might find it as a useful introduction. So when you think of Italy as a wine producing country, it's important to be aware that until the 1980s, really, there was no real, let's say, culture of fine wine in the way we have it nowadays. The Italian person, on average, would drink loose wine, bulk wine, in large quantities of quite low alcoholic level. So it was common to drink 10.5, 11% alcohol. And it is even nowadays, for certain generations, wine is really a part of everyday drinking. It's on the table. It's culturally a very strong element of lifestyle. Why am I saying this? This brings us to the history of viticulture in Italy that dates back to, of course, hundreds of years ago. But the point I'm trying to making is, where does Alto Piemonte stand within all this? Now, when we think of Italian wines in the nowadays culture, we think of wine regions, and a beginner starts to define Italy, probably telling the difference between northern Italy, central Italy, and southern Italy. And probably the beginner would name three regions: Piemonte, Tuscany, and the Veneto, as the most important ones for quantity and quality. These are the ones that normally come to people when I ask them, which wines do you know? But let's focus then on Piemonte, which is in the northwest of Italy. And why does Piemonte stand in the top three of Italian wine regions? Or if I'm not saying the top three in absolute, but generally speaking, when you question the average consumer, he will come up with these three reasons. So why is it one of the ones that really comes to mind? Well, first of all, I would say Piemonte comes to mind because we are lucky enough to work with one of the most extraordinary wine varieties in the world, grape varieties in the world, which is Nebbiolo. Nebbiolo is a grape variety which is very fastidious to grow, but it is the grape variety which is responsible for some of the most amazing wines in the world. Anybody who...
Let me stop you. Sorry, Marina. We've lost connection for a second there. And you were talking about Nebbiolo, which is like the one word that got cut out.
Fantastic. It was the whole point of my introduction. Like, why is Piemonte one of the top Italian regions for wine? Is because we're lucky enough to work with Nebbiolo, which is one of the best, arguably one of the top 5 grape varieties in the world. Why am I saying this? Not just because it's our grape variety, but really, when you speak about world-class wine, what does the consumer have in mind? What do we have in mind? We have in mind wines that are able to build a unique personality, and this is usually done through very long aging in bottle. And there are a very limited number of grape varieties which are able to do that. So Cabernet Sauvignon is probably one of the most planted and best known. Pinot Noir and Nebbiolo has nothing really less than these two grape varieties. And obviously, I must say, because it's in my heart, it's definitely got everything you would want to create world-class wines. One of the grape varieties with the best aging potential. But why am I focusing on Piemonte? Because unlike Pinot Noir and unlike Cabernet Sauvignon, it is not an internationally grown grape variety, because it is a pain in the neck for the grape grower. It will only perform top quality results in very, very few areas. And Piemonte is virtually the only place in the world where Nebbiolo can give top quality results. Of course, there are a few bordering areas with Piemonte. I'm thinking of Valtellina and certain areas of Valle d'Aosta, where, of course, the grapevine doesn't follow strict geographical borders, but the northwest of Italy has the best spots for Nebbiolo in the world. So when I'm saying this, I need to restrict a bit more. So we've spoken of Italy, we've spoken of Piemonte, but now we have to focus even more. So I said Nebbiolo can grow anywhere. In Piemonte, no, it can't. There are specific sites in Piemonte where Nebbiolo performs at best. You probably heard of Barolo. You probably heard of Barbaresco. Maybe you're totally obscure with Bocca. Maybe the word Gattinara or Alto Piemonte or Spanna is totally obscure of that, but there is a reason. Of course, Bocca is a cru of Alto Piemonte. We will talk about it tonight. Spanna is the local name in Alto Piemonte for Nebbiolo. And I might touch there as well, even if we're not tasting Spanna, but it's very important in our production. Gattinara is another wine which is very famous for Alto Piemonte wine lovers. Kölner Weinkeller might still have some bottles of our Gattinara. We're not tasting it tonight, but I'm just mentioning these crus because they're all very important vineyard sites. And now I will ask a rhetorical question, which brings us to the very history of Alto Piemonte, and is, so if you claim that Alto Piemonte is such a fantastic wine region and can give world-class wines, why does everybody know about Barolo, for example, and Alto Piemonte is totally obscure? Well, there are historical reasons, and it has not always been this way. There has been a development of the area throughout the last century, which has had some consequences in the market. And if you're ready, Mick, you guide me, I can start to explain you how Nebbiolo was conceived before, at the beginning of the century, and where we are now, just to give you an idea of the reason why, the point I'm trying to make, the quality is top notch, but the fame is not huge.
Yeah. Exactly. That's kind of like the point where it touches onto what you were referencing before, because like you said, there's historical reasons for this. And one of the reasons is what happened during the war and right after the war. So please continue. You can maybe make the link back to your grandfather, Bernardo.
Sure. So before the two wars at the beginning of the 20th century, Alto Piemonte had over 40,000 hectares of vineyard surface. That's huge. If you came nowadays, you can, if you drive through the area, you can hardly see a vineyard. It is nothing like a typical wine growing scenario. However, the parcels where the vineyard is grown, and fortunately they're expanding, can yield among the most exciting wines. Now, why is that? Well, as you might know, the grapevine is a very a very labor-intensive type of crop. If you abandon a vineyard for a couple of years, the woods will grow into it at the speed of light, and within 5 years, you've lost a vineyard completely. So what happened? Not just that applies to all vineyards, but in Italy, in Alto Piemonte, where we are, not only you have this aspect, but you also have to think that vineyards are in very dramatically deep slope. The scenario is comparable to some of the slopes you see in the Mosel, for example. So you have terracing, you have steep hills, and you have a lot of rock underneath the vineyard. It's not fertile soil, it's not easy to grow, it's not mechanizable. So it really takes a lot of labor to grow a vineyard in this area. And you can only do it if then you get top quality results that will allow you to pay for that effort, of course. So the quality of the wine has to be outstanding. Now, as you can imagine, during the war, labor became a luxury because most men had to abandon their homes, and women who were left at home with the children were more interested in survival than in making top quality wines. So what happened? When men came back, most of these vineyards had been eaten up by the woods again, and people were too hungry to think about viticulture as a way of investing, because in Alto Piemonte we can have amazing results with our vines because the terroir is very difficult to grow, is very infertile. So the wines, the grapes have the potential to give you very fine wines with high acidity and great aging potential, etc. But it can take up to 10 years from the time when you plant a grape and the time you sell your first bottle. And so if people had the problem of feeding their family today, they could not think of fine winemaking as a way of doing that. And so what happened?
Yeah. Let me just interject here, because I think this is a super important point, because the same thing that you were just referencing, that the men had to go to war and couldn't care about the vineyards, this was happening all around Europe. And there was you had similar things going on in the Mosel, you had similar things going on in Burgundy, and the rest of Piemont as well. But what's so important about this is that you had to keep the wines of Alto Piemonte it's basically necessary to release them very late. So you not only you have to replant the vines, you have to make the wine, which takes more than a year, it takes two or 3 years. But if you have Riesling, you can sell it young. It's age worthy, but you can also sell it and drink it young. But that's not really the case with the Nebbiolo of Alto Piemonte. So I was just trying to emphasize this point that you made, because I think it's very important to recognize this, that there's like this specific thing about the Alto Piemonte that made it harder to regrow into the culture of wine growing.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, thank you, Mick. It's very appropriate. And there is another thing. The Alto Piemonte being strategically located between Milan, it's only like an hour's drive, even less, from Alto Piemonte to Milan, and Monte Rosa and the passes to France, to Europe. It was a strategic area for industry to develop. So after the war, there was a flourishing, especially of the steel industry, taps for water and valves. Mm-hmm. And the other industry that flourished was textile material. So brands that you might have heard of, Italian brands like Lanificio Cerruti or Ermenegildo Zegna or Loro Piana, they're all super premium brands. They all started here. Then they might have been bought by larger corporates nowadays, but they were genuinely made and produced all here at the time. And so there was a cultural aspect. A young man in his late teens, early 20s, did not want to be a farmer. He wanted to be a worker in a factory. It meant I could tell my girlfriend or wife, I'm out of the house from 8 to 5, but then I'm bringing home this fixed salary on this day for every day of my life. This will allow us to have this specific lifestyle. And so it was a thing to be. I remember in the late 1980s, there was still this strong cultural thing, and people were almost ashamed, young people especially, to have a job in agriculture over here.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of the 1980s is a crucial period that makes a difference between Barolo, that became famous at that time, and us. And there are several elements to keep in consideration. So, as I said, after the war, there was a boom. There was economic boom all over Europe. It was the case also here. And for Alto Piemonte, it was the flourishing of industry, not of viticulture. But if you look at what was happening in the Langhe region down in Barolo, it wasn't the same. The only factory that's really world famous from that area and that started at the time was Ferrero, responsible for Nutella. I'm sure you're all familiar with the spread, but families really had to find something to get by. There wasn't the same amount of jobs in industry as there was a couple of hours drive north. So I think people, the producers, had a more intense drive to get out of that situation. And in the 1980s, especially in the beginning, like late 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, wines like Barolo, nobody really wanted them. I have producers telling stories that world famous, that they were giving you a case of Barolo for free if you bought a certain amount of the lower wines like Dolcetto and Barbera. So at that time, they really needed to get smart, and they really did a great job of getting out of their region, going to France. Some pioneers learned how to make wine even better, and they improved the product, and they went out to the US, they built a huge market, and between the 1980s and now, they just skyrocketed. Alto Piemonte simply did not have that hunger. People over here were not hungry at all. B, those who were making wine throughout this period there were too few production. The surface was very small, so there wasn't enough wine in the market to make the wines famous. But despite this situation, some producers, which are now considered historical, and my grandfather would be one of them, carried on putting these wines in the market. So the experts knew that as niche wines, Alto Piemonte was definitely a place to go if you wanted to find top quality wines, world-class wines. But you needed to be an expert to know about Alto Piemonte, because it wasn't so waved in the press, in the media. There wasn't that much wine around, to be honest. So that's one of the reasons. But why is it coming back to, I wouldn't call it fashion, but it's coming back to the attention of consumers nowadays? Well, because in the 1990s, the scenario changed again. I remember myself, because I was old enough to remember in the 1990s, there was a huge crisis of the industry. That is when most industries that gave many jobs here relocated the production in developing countries. So many people ran out of jobs at the same time. And at the same time, the European Union was giving out very interesting grants to young farmers who wanted to re-establish past viticultural businesses, so past vineyards. So many families rediscovered that, oh, my great-grandfather had that piece of land, let's reinvest. And that's why, starting from the 1990s, we had quite a few investments and many new producers that came in the region, they had the sound knowledge, certitude that in the past great wine was made here, the hope that they could go back and produce outstanding wine nowadays. And I would say that now in 2022, it is great. We are seeing a flourishing of the area and even interesting investments that are growing more and more. So who knows? I always get asked the question, what do I think of the future? I don't think the wine region will have a huge development because there is only a very limited amount of land that it's still available for viticulture. But probably the knowledge of it will be as big as it is for some world-class wine areas like Champagne and Bordeaux and Burgundy. I'm sure Alto Piemonte will soon be a must go to, like the Mosel, for example, and other, also in Germany, you have the Mosel is the most famous one, but also the Pfalz, for example, you have great locations that are now a must go place.
Totally. Let's hope for that. I think it's actually a very nice look into the future. If you don't go like, oh, we're going to be the largest and we're going to be the best or anything, that there's like a sort of humility that you say, well, we're going to be famous, but we're not. You're not putting the gauntlet down, trying to be better than anybody else. Which I find it's, for me personally, that's something that I like, even though competition is everything. Shall we start with the first wine, because I think we're a little bit on the clock as well.
We got a bit carried away. Sorry about that.
No, don't worry. I think it's super interesting, and I hope that everybody that's assisting also finds it interesting. So far, there haven't been any questions, but usually once we start tasting the wines and we're going into the thick of it, probably more questions are going to arise. So the first wine that we're drinking is the Campiraudi, which, I guess with my little camera, they're all going to look the same. But this is the Campiraudi. And it's a library release. It's from 2012, even though we cannot advertise its vintage. But the wine it's from the vintage of 2012, even though it's not like advertised. But you can tell by the lot number on the back label, which is right here. So. What can you tell us about the vintage? What can you tell us about the idea behind the Campiraudi wine itself?
Yeah. So first of all, I would begin with the name. Campiraudi is one of the ancient Latin names of Alto Piemonte. And so it's the name that we have chosen, my grandfather chose, for our invitation to a general taste of the area. So it's not a site-specific wine, but it's the typical blend that our grandfathers had, which was 70% Nebbiolo, 30% Vespolina. Now, what does one give and what does the other? The blend, for those of you who are used to Bordeaux, for example, we could say that the Nebbiolo is a bit the Cabernet Sauvignon, and the Vespolina is a bit like the Merlot. So the first one is giving the structure, the tannins, the aromatics, and Vespolina is adding a little bit of interesting details. It was used also to make the Nebbiolo more approachable in youth. That was done especially at the time when Nebbiolo might have been really a bit underripe because yields were higher, the climate was cooler. Nowadays, in Alto Piemonte, we do not really need to add Vespolina to make a great approachable wine because for a mix of improved viticulture and higher temperatures, our Nebbiolo ripens perfectly in most vintages. So it's a stylistic choice to be consistent with the origins. Now, Vespolina shares with Syrah the same aromatic compound that makes Syrah smell of pepper, black pepper, and spiciness in general. So it's a gentle touch of spiciness that is added to Nebbiolo that makes it unique and from this area. So when people approach Campiraudi, I always say, put your glass put your nose in the glass and smell Alto Piemonte. And when you're tasting a library release like tonight, I also add, well, and then try to figure, if this is what a base wine is like after a bit of aging, you can think of what a cru, a top quality site, can give you. This is giving you an idea of several things that you should pick up. First of all, the aromatics on the nose and on the palate develop very slowly. The wine doesn't taste tertiary. It's still pretty much secondary. Of course, it is developing a bit of tertiary notes, but it's mainly secondary. And on the palate, you have this vibrant, fresh acidity that lets you consider how the wine can still be drunk for a number of years. So that's the Campiraudi. A word about the name Campiraudi, which is also linked to the label. So if you look at our label, the image of this Roman warrior on the front comes from the battle of the Campiraudi, because Campiraudi is the name of a battle that was fought in 101 before Christ in the surroundings of Alto Piemonte. And it was the Roman army against the Germanic people of the Cimbri. And the Romans managed to keep the Cimbri out of Alto Piemonte, which was very important for viticulture because, of course, the Germanic people brought with them the Germanic culture. And we speak of the three main elements when it comes to the food culture of the two peoples. So with Italy and the Mediterranean culture being based on wheat, olive oil, and wine, and the Germanic culture being based on on meat, animal fat, and beer. So the fact that the Romans won this battle was very important because it saved the tradition of winemaking and the Mediterranean culture, which led to having Alto Piemonte as it is nowadays. And we have this background. And if you go to Gattinara, which is the most important cru of Alto Piemonte, you will find that the main street of the town is crossed by two side roads, which are entitled to Quinto Lutazio Catulo, which is the consul on the label, and the general Caio Mario. And the name of the town, Gattinara, actually could come from the Latin Catuli Ara, the altar of Catulus, which is represented on the label. So that's a little bit of history behind the design of the labels as well, which is linked to the Battle of the Campiraudi.
Yeah. I think it's striking how fresh the wine is. I mean, this is 10 years old, and I would never have guessed, because the smell is still like flowery, perfumey. It's very light and aromatic. There's almost no tertiary notes, like you said, and the acidity is there. The tannins are still grippy. This could definitely go for another 10 years. Probably longer. I don't know. How long have you kept Campiraudi? How long have you tried keeping it? What are your experiences?
Grandfather, which are still singing. So it's a matter then when you go above a certain limit of time, I guess it's the single bottle, but the potential is very high. And personal preference, of course.
Yeah, yes, of course. I mean, not everybody. It's also important to know that not everybody actually likes the taste of the wine that was aged for quite a long time. Well, you always have like this fame and idea that the older the wine, the better. It's not really the case, actually, not for everybody, at least. I mean, there's some people that are really into old and aged wines, and other people just prefer to drink their wines on the younger side, which is fine. I, at least from my perspective as a merchant, it's always fine. Like, drink your wines however you'd like to drink them, and I would personally also veer to the younger side of things. I really like the acidity, the vibrancy, it's sort of more. There's more action, you know? So, and there's quite a lot of action on your palate if you drink this wine. Maybe we should pass on to the next one, which would be the first of our 2 bottles of Bocca that we have. Marina has said that it would be best to drink the 16 first and then the 17. So here is the Bocca 2016, which we're going to try now. If you want to, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the cru of Bocca and the specific blend of this wine.
Sure. So the cru of Bocca is one of the tiniest crus of Italy. We have about 25 hectares of vineyard altogether between the 12-ish producers of the region. So it's very tiny. But what makes it extraordinary? Well, the story is Bocca is inside the caldera of a supervolcano which exploded 500 million years ago. Why do I stress this? Well, because when we speak about top wines, it is always very important to understand the soil where they're grown, the soil type, and the climate where they thrive. And when you have a unique soil type in the world, so unique that it has also been proclaimed a UNESCO geosite for the uniqueness of the soil, I think it's worth explaining a bit more. So what makes it unique? Why is it recognized as a UNESCO geosite for its unique composition? Well, when this gigantic explosion occurred, you have to think that the continents had not drifted yet, and there was this gigantic explosion called supervolcano. The term refers to it's a journalistic term that refers to the fact that the explosion was so big, had the power of about 10 atom bombs put together, and it was one of the main events that triggered the drift of the European continent from the African continent, to the extent that some of the soil that you find on the hills of this part of Alto Piemonte have the same soil type that you can find in Northern Africa. So it's really the place where one of the cracks happened. And you have to imagine then, when this happened, hundreds of cube kilometers of pyroclastic material was shot up in the sky and recomposed randomly on the ground, forming a caldera. Now, when you think of one of the things that gives wine a unique character is the complexity of the minerals in the soil. Now here it is as if you put together hundreds of cube kilometers of different soil types, put them together in a giant mixer, and then threw them randomly on the soil. Now, no human being can possibly do that, but this natural, we would call it catastrophe probably nowadays, but this natural extreme event happened, and it happened here. So we have the unique privilege of growing our vines in an area with such a huge complexity of minerals. But not only that, during the formation of the Alps, so not hundreds of millions of years ago, but hundreds of thousands of years ago, the African bloc kept pushing against the European bloc. And of course, as you know, the Alps tilted up and formed. But this caldera was uplifted and tilted 90 degrees. So if you walk from Bocca northwards towards Monte Rosa for about 25 kilometers, It's as if you took an elevator that went down in depth inside the earth crust for 25 kilometers. So in our area, you can find unique soils like the peridotite in Italian. I'm sure in English it's something like peridotite or something like that, of the mantle of the earth crust, which again can be only seen in very few places in the world. And it's part of the mixture of the soil types here in the Valsesia. And Bocca specifically is composed mainly by this fossilized volcanic soil type called, also referred to as vulcanite, and it's basically only rocks. So the vines of Nebbiolo and Vespolina have to crumble these very fragile rocks. If you pick them up, you can break them with your hands. And with the roots, they have to dig through the rocks to find water and nutrients. And this puts them through very healthy secondary metabolic stress that translates into those unique, supple aromas that we then appreciate in the wine. From a practical point of view, if I may say a joke, it means that viticulture is as hard as hell. I mean, nobody wants to, it's really labor intensive to grow grapes there, a bit like those terraces in the Moselle, those steep hills in the northern Rhone Valley. I'm thinking about terracing in some parts of the Douro Valley in Portugal. So it's a very dramatic scenario where we're working, not possible to mechanize most of the operations and all the rest, but really it is worth it because we have these steep south-facing slopes where Nebbiolo really has an ideal spot. And we have Vespolina in the blend as well, which has always historically been produced there. Why Vespolina? Well, because historically farmers were smart, so they always made sure they had many different varieties in the fields, a bit like apples and pears and many crops. You always grew different varieties to make sure that if one went wrong, you had a B plan. But also they grew Vespolina, which is, by the way, from a DNA point of view, a daughter of Nebbiolo. It was chosen throughout the years as the best blending companion. So there was an option to blend, to not blend. When the disciplinari di produzione, so the laws that established the crew of Bocca as such, were established at the end of the 1960s, producers decided to keep Vespolina as an important part of the blend to preserve this tradition and make Bocca a unique expression of Alto Piemonte. Now, it's one of the northmost sites of the Alto Piemonte and one of the latest to be picked. So you have an expression of Nebbiolo, which is very fine, sort of late ripening. So you have to think slow formation of the aromas in the grape, late picked, so more concentration. So in Bocca, you really have a lot of potential for more supple tannins, acidity very high, so more elegance, the freshness that cuts through, and an aging potential of 40 years or more. And this, and most top quality sites for Nebbiolo can give you that. But Vespolina, especially I would say in the first 10 years of the life of the wine, will give an added value in terms of complexity, bringing these peppery notes. And in my experience, after a few years of aging, when you are above 10, 15 years, in a blind tasting though, the role of Vespolina is not so, it doesn't stand out as making Nebbiolo so different. It kind of melts, and then the tertiary notes of Nebbiolo become dominant anyway. So in the long run, it really doesn't differ very much from the, I would say, in a good way, stereotypical aroma bouquet that you would expect from a Nebbiolo with a couple of decades on its back, if you see what I mean. Tarmac and forest floor, and it doesn't make it that different. It sort of blends in harmoniously. That's the point.
Right. It shows really nice now. Like right after opening, it was still super fragrant and was like it exploded out of the glass when I first tried it. What was it, like 1.5 hours ago or something, before we started talking. Now it's really come. It settled down a little bit, and it's really come to its own. It's very, very nice wine. It's so velvety, and there's like already a hint of tertiary notes. There's a hint of Maggi. I don't know if you know what that is. I think it's a very German thing. It's a little sauce that we use. It's kind of like Worcester sauce or something. So there's a hint of that, but there's also like the roses. I'm not actually getting the pepper anymore. I did in the Campiraldi, but not in this one. I think it's might have molten away. But yeah, it's a really, really lovely wine. Like it quite a bit, and it's perfect to drink now, actually. It's very, very nice. So how was the vintage? Because what we're doing now is that like the 2016 vintage. Because what we're doing now is tasting the next vintage, which is the 2017, also Bocca. So the same wine, but 1 year later.
Yeah.
And it showed completely different. Like when we first tasted, before we started the live stream, the difference was huge. I'm very curious how it is now, like with a little bit of air in the bottle. But maybe you can tell us about the vintages. How did they both go? What are like the specific things that happened?
16 was a bit of a more classic vintage. If you by classic, I mean the time of picking was more in line with what is normal here, sort of beginning of October for the Nebbiolo, and the temperatures weren't particularly different from what you would expect. 16 has been a relatively easy vintage for making wine. 17 was a bit more challenging in terms of climate. It was a warmer vintage, and the grapes were picked significantly earlier compared to normal. I remember harvesting at around 20th of September, which is pretty extraordinary. That's about the time when we harvest, I wouldn't say the whites, but yeah, I mean, we generally harvest the whites that were on the 15th, and then Nebbiolo was ready. So there were a few challenges in terms of timing. Less rain during the vintage, so a bit more concentration. And then again, as every vintage has its own differences, and it would be very interesting to get your feedback, because for me it's always very difficult to say the differences. It's about like comparing your own children, so I'm sure a teacher can do that, that's their job. And in your position, you work with the wines and with the final consumers, you don't make them, so it might be easier for you to make unbiased comments.
Yeah, well, the 2017, like what we are the same, basically. It's more in line with what we had before, like when it was first opened. It's still very tight wound. It's a little bit taut if you compare it to the 2016, which is already like velvety and very easy on the mouth. And this one, I like to say it bites back, So my guess would be that this one, the 2017, takes a little longer in the cellar, but then will probably like really unfold into something very nice and beautiful. It's not the perfect time to open the 2017 bottle now, I think, but it's super interesting to compare them both, because tasting the 2016, you can imagine what is going to happen to the 2017. My guess would be that the early harvest gives it, probably more acidity, and like the tannins are probably a little bit different. It's really hard for me to say like where it will go from here. Actually, It's I guess I'm a little bit out of my depth, but what would you say? How would you?
Interesting, though, because I've been making similar comments, and especially to people who've asked me, which wine would you recommend to buy in store for maybe 5 years? Or I have found myself recommending the 17 quite a lot. And I have the feeling that it is a vintage that will reveal itself later, whereas 16 is just, as you said, rounder, softer. 16 has been an easier vintage throughout the whole of Piemonte. However, we always now, I used to be more scared about comments like maybe 15 years ago in the beginning, but now I really see surprises, and I often see that wines which are a bit shy, all you need to do with our wines, I mean, because of the typicalities, just forget about them and rediscover them.
Mm-hmm.
I have had very, very good surprises, and if I may say, so far with wines from Alto Piemonte, never disappointment. Well, of course, the odd corked bottle, but a disappointment that could be led to the content of the wine itself. Not really, not even with the white, which is a great variety that we're not tasting tonight, but has many similarities with Riesling, Erbaluce.
Yeah. One thing I don't think like even if you give the 17 like 5 more years in the cellar and you forget about it and you go ahead and drink the 16 now, I don't think that 17 will ever be like this velvety and unctuous as the 16 is right now. It's always probably going to be more on like the elegant side, more on a lighter side. So it also comes down to a matter of taste, because you have what basically looks like the same wine at first, but I think that both cater to probably different palates, different tastes in the consumer. If you have the time to wait for the 17 to unwind and to unfold itself, you're going to end up with a much more elegant and lighter and maybe even more beautiful wine than the 16, while the 16 is like a crowd pleaser, like I could definitely see myself pouring the 16 for people that know very little about wine and them enjoying it, while the 17 is probably going to be more, you need to be a little bit more of a connoisseur to actually appreciate all like the complexities and beauties of it once it starts unfolding.
Yeah, and as I always like to say when I speak at different levels, so professionals or wine geeks or consumers who are at the first couple of cases of wine of their life, it's always a lot also about what you eat it with and who you eat it with, because the situation, sometimes I make the joke is like, oh, I had this wine and it was delicious, and I had this other wine and it was rubbish. I was like, yes, but if you had wine A on the seashore with the person of whom you love the most, and I'm sure it was an amazing wine. And if you had this top crew the night, like you just had a very bad argument with somebody, and then, it's the situation, it's the context. I mean, even climate has an effect on how the wine tastes in the glass. It's such a living creature, wine. And I think one of the wisest people I've talked to in the world of wines, it's always about this glass of wine poured at this very moment. Even if you pull the same bottle out of the same case 3 weeks later in a different context, your experience will be different. There will be a substance that doesn't change, but the nuances will be different. And I think that is such a charming thing of wine in general.
Right. There's the saying that you can't jump into the same river twice. I think it goes back to the Greeks, but I'm not 100% sure. And it's about like the river is always flowing, so you're never going to be like, even if you jump into the river from the same bridge, it's always going to be different water that you jump into.
I think it's Heraclitus you're quoting, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm a winemaker.
Well, we're both on our computers. We could Google it, but we won't.
I have my hand here.
Exactly.
I'll let our guests Google it.
I'm proud of my half knowledge. Anyway, so that's like the same thing applies to wine as well. Like wine will always be changing, and you cannot drink the same glass of wine twice as well. Just like you can't jump into the same river twice. And that is the beauty, because it always also reminds you of the flow of life itself.
It's true, very true. And we are all very privileged to be working in such a fascinating industry and working with a living element, which is mainly about enjoyment and pleasure and bringing people together, as I hope it's happening tonight, and build a community. And it's so nice. Usually wine communities are a fantastic place to hang out and with people with genuine interest and a genuine passion.
Exactly,
really
and enthusiasm. That's I'm enthusiastically going to pour another glass of the 2016 and enjoy that one, because, like I said, it's in a perfect state right now. And yeah, I'm going to thank you, Marina, for your time. I'm going to thank everyone that was watching. The video is probably going to go up on YouTube, so as we can't jump into the same river twice, maybe we're talking to you out of time. Maybe it's 5 years in the future and we're still on YouTube having the same conversation.
We'll see.
Well, Marina, thank you. Thank you very much for an introduction to your wines and the Alto Piemonte. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope everybody has a good bottle of wine open and enjoy. Have a great evening.